Okie dokie. Welcome everybody to this, our second Q community call. We've slightly changed the naming format, so we'll just name it with Q community call and then give it the date afterwards. The #1, #2 was getting a bit annoying when I was referring to these community calls in GitHub issues because it insisted on linking to issue 1, issue 2, etc., which was going to be pretty tiresome for everybody. It's only been 3 weeks since the last call, so this is probably a relatively short call in terms of project update. So we're going to spend a bit more time on community things this time around, which is all good. So hopefully the screen share is working. It is great. So we are going to do some quick project updates though. Talking about, as we talked on the last call, we sort of shared with everybody what the focus is for those working for the full-time contributors, what the focus is for the rest of 2022. So we're going to hear a bit from everybody in each of those. Carmen's going to give us an update from the first docs and content call that we had. Just going to briefly chat about conference participation in the 2 conferences we're currently at. And then we're going to do quite a bit more on the community update side of things this time around, and a spotlight, as we advertised last time, on Tony, who's joining us. So welcome, Tony. And then we're going to wrap up with future calls and do a sort of Q&A, whatever we want to call it, office hours at the end of all of this. So in terms of a project update, it took a rather longer than expected to actually create a list of umbrella issues because there ended up being a fair number of them, and there needed to be a bit of linking between each of them. So all those umbrella issues that I mentioned we would create on the last call have now been created, and I've added the long list of those in a comment as part of the GitHub discussion from last time around. So please go and subscribe to those that you're interested. That's kind of the idea, is that as we talk about these umbrella issues, they're like subtopics that folks might be interested in following, and then we'll create child issues off that, sort of for the detail of whatever it might be. So, but these umbrella issues are really designed to be areas where folks can subscribe their interest, comment at the top level, and then the detail will be hashed out in sub issues, if you like. Kind of in a related way, we've also created an announce GitHub discussion, and that's 2022, which is actually, that's quite a lucky thing to have done, that the announce issue is 2022. Anyway, what we'll be doing there is, whilst we use Twitter predominantly for things like community-related retweeting or tweets that would actually be sort of interest to folks in our Twitter community, what we're going to do with the GitHub discussion announce, which is a locked discussion, is just use it as a single point where folks can subscribe and follow more project-related announcements that we have to make. So whether that be, for example, a new release that we've cut. So as the sort of first announcement, I announced the fact that we've cut v0.5.0 alpha 1. Maybe there is sort of like a major announcement as far as a breaking change that we need to make is concerned. So that way, if folks subscribe to 2022, they'll be sure that they stay up to date with all the important project news. Really, the need for this is that there's no way of only subscribing to GitHub discussions announcements, a subcategory. So we've just created this as a nice simple way for folks to subscribe, follow along, but it's locked down so that you don't have to worry about getting any noise or chatter from other people responding to it. We will keep this a very sort of select number of notifications and announcements that we want to make via this list here, so that we don't bombard people with too much noise. One other issue to call out since last time is, because we've had a few discussions around this, and that is issue number 2000. Again, a pretty special number there. That a number of folks have said they're not too comfortable with the way that by default Q includes ancestor files in the same package. Ancestor as in terms of ancestor directories. And that people want to make this optional or have some optionality around the way in which they load Q. So I created that issue there. Please jump into that and add details of your experience with that. We're also open to adding different modes of loading within QLoad as well. So this is just a starter, this issue. So please let us know if the way in which you load Q is a bit too awkward for you. That's the kind of thing we're trying to solicit via issue 2000 and more. Incidentally, please interrupt if anybody's got anything they want to question or chime in on. As I said, we've cut version 0.5.0 alpha 1. There is still an outstanding stack of CLs in GitHub that we're waiting to check in. But we wanted to get some exposure to the changes that are already in TIP at the moment. So they're all linked from here. Is that well, the top of that final stack is linked from here. There are 14 issues that we have, and we now have a version 0.5.0 milestone in GitHub, and we'll use those milestones in future. Only really pay attention to the 0.5.0 milestone for now. There's a whole load of old milestones that really we need to delete because they don't actually mean anything right at this point in time. So keep track of the milestone, the issues in the milestone. If you think there's something that should be in there for version 0.5.0, now is obviously a great time to flag that to make sure that we do cover it before we cut the actual version 0.5.0 release. But that is likely to be at least a couple of weeks away. Not least because we have to land those remaining CLs, as I said, for the comprehensions and cycle stack. But there's quite a lot of shaking out, I'm sure, in terms of bugs that people have found already, and we can talk about a couple of those later on. So yes, whilst there's no real rush, the sooner you can raise issues that should be included in that release, the better. A couple of proposals. Daniel, did you want to talk about the first one there, the Go Release Support Policy 1937?
Yeah, so we brought this up at the last call. Essentially, we want to pin down how many Go releases we want to support for each Q release. So Q is built on Go, so we need to decide how many Go releases we support and test on. The current idea that has no arguments against it is supporting 2 major Go versions, which is the same thing that Upstream does in terms of security fixes and so on. So I will be posting a comment there shortly saying 1 last week for any final comments. Assuming there's no negative feedback, we'll just go ahead with 2 versions.
Sounds great, thanks. And just a reminder of the required fields proposal that Marcel or Roger, hands up.
Yeah, I just thought I'd mention that that has one significant potential impact is in that it does open the door for us using generics in the implementation. And if we did that, then that would mean that not only do we not support older Go versions, it means it wouldn't even compile with the older Go versions. So if you really need an older Go version, then you need to speak up, because that is definitely going to happen at some point.
Yep. Thanks for flagging that. It might, Daniel, I can't remember whether we point that out in the discussion itself. It might worth just be reiterating that point, just to trigger some folks into responding if they haven't already responded. Just a reminder on 1951, this is the required fields proposal that Marcel talked about last time. Again, we're super happy to chat to folks who may have concerns or issues or ideas around this proposal. So far, the feedback has been no feedback on the proposal itself, but in all discussions we've had with everybody, it's very much been that the required fields proposal V2 aligns with what people actually need. So it's been positive feedback, albeit silent feedback. Next slide here. Rog, over to you on this one here. Bit of a modules update.
Yeah, so I've been, I haven't actually been implementing it as yet. I'm still trying to work out the details of the actual proposal, because there are a bunch of things we kind of took as a starting point Go's module implementation, because it seems it has a number of very nice properties and has been thought about deeply, and a load of stuff has already been decided, but Q is not Go. And so there are actually a number of things which are actually still up in the air, to be fair. Like even in like Q does not have, for example, it doesn't have global variables, it doesn't have package types like Go does. So it is actually possible you could avoid doing the deduplication thing, avoid doing the module version resolution thing at all. There are ups and downs to that, and there's also the notion of the what Go uses the semantic import path, the semantic import versioning. That's also exactly how to do that in Q is also an issue. This whole thing plays into what exactly does it mean in Q to be compatible? Because in Go, for example, it's quite clear what rules, how you can preserve backward compatibility. There are some fairly standard rules for that, in a sense. But in Q, the answer's maybe less clear cut, and there are some arguments to say that you can't make any changes and be fully backwardly compatible in Go in Q. And so there are a bunch of trade-offs to be made, and I'm interested. I've talked to some people about that, had some useful input, and I'm very interested to talk to anyone like Sam. I'm sure you have some ideas on this matter, for example. So yeah, lots of opinions. Everyone's got lots of opinions, but somehow we have to come up with a solution that's more right than wrong. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, I guess, Roger, in that situation, it's also useful if people are able to bring opinions that also have concrete use cases with them, so that we can help to sort of put all those blocks together and look at it in terms of the sum of a number of use cases, and then what's like I don't want to say the least worst option, because that sounds a bit pessimistic, but at the same time, use cases obviously help in that situation to help make things concrete, no pun intended.
Absolutely. So for that point of view, for example, a conversation I had with Jonathan Matthews recently was really helpful, because that was a use case I hadn't thought about. But also we want to be providing for use cases that merge in the medium-term future, when hopefully there's a whole ecosystem emerging around Q, when we've got different levels of publisher and consumers and producers and publishers at different levels. So hopefully something that enables that to flourish.
Jonathan, you got your hand up, please.
I just wanted to ask if that issue 2032 is the right one to be putting in. It would be nice if X, or is it more of a implementation focused place? And if so, where do you want the it would be nice if X things to be pushed?
Good question. Which one's issue 32 again?
2032 is the tracking issue for. So I didn't want to effectively take the existing modules proposal as it exists, which is, I can't remember what number, and effectively repurpose that, because there's a whole load of history and discussion in it which we want to sort of preserve, as opposed to putting to one side, right? So it's more a case of creating a fresh issue there for folks to follow as the tracking issue. And I guess Jonathan's question, Roger, is whether you want feedback under that issue, or whether you want to perhaps create a GitHub discussion specifically for folks to provide feedback under that one. Over to you.
That's a good question. I was thinking that yes, we should absolutely reply and reply to that issue, but maybe it'd be better to have a discussion. Because then you can thread it.
Yep.
So we'll maybe make a decision about that. I mean, yeah, we'll either create a discussion or reply. You can certainly reply now, and then you can convert a reply into a discussion, I think, maybe, or maybe you can't.
Yeah, well, you can convert an issue into discussion, but I think we'll want to leave that issue in place as like the umbrella one.
Yeah.
But then we can always move a reply if you need to, sort of manually, by deleting it or whatever. So
yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, Rog, I guess the way for folks to, if you create, let's just imagine we actually create a discussion off that where people can provide feedback. They can reply to that discussion, which will link to from the tracking issue. But otherwise, folks can just ping into the tracking issue and say, hey, where do we go for X, Y, Z? Okay. Cool. Daniel, over to you.
So for Unity, we have a tracking issue for supporting private registrations of private repositories holding Q code. We did have 2 private submissions of Q code, which were really helpful already for the 0.5 alpha release. And we've got a few more in the pipeline of people who are interested, but right now this is done sort of manually at the moment, so we're just working through them as we can. But essentially, we still want more people to onboard onto Unity. If you've got public code to onboard onto Unity, you can just do it by following the instructions on the README, which is the same that has been happening for a few months already. As far as private repos, get in touch for now, because we don't have an automated process. but by the end of the quarter, we will have a more polished process for both public and private registrations of Q code. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Not much to share this month.
Cool. Thank you very much. Dominic, Project Ops.
Yes, hello. So basically, they're a quick update on Project Ops. So they're the more traditional things like operations or project management, but currently we're especially focusing on collecting user feedback across various channels because it's really interesting and great that I just read it here, lots of opinions. There are so many great ideas and takes and use cases for Q, and it's really interesting for us to gather it and also synthesize it, and in the end connect the dots, because that makes it actionable, and there we can see like common trends, themes, and maybe some overlaps, and also learn. And that, yeah, that improves collaboration. And the other thing is like measuring the adoption of the Q project. This is done by talks, but also like continuously talking to users, looking at the ecosystem on GitHub and on Slack. So this is a focus that this improves sustainable for the future, in a sustainable way for the future. I think that was a very short update, so I hand over to the next one.
And no, just briefly to add to that point on connecting the dots between different use cases. Marcel, as we'll talk about later on, has just given his talk at QCon, and that was really a focus of a lot of the questions that follow up afterwards of, oh, I'm using Q here, but I'm interested in where else Q can be used and how actually I make that happen. How do I sort of pipeline, for want of a better phrase, these things together? How do I actually operationally achieve using Q in multiple different places? So that's as much okay, what sort of tooling do I need, as also, okay, what story is there behind these sorts of things? I think it's interesting to hear how people are using Q, but also how they're joining those dots themselves, and how are they, what tooling are they using in those situations to make that happen. Thanks, Dominic. Aram, over to you on WebAssembly.
I don't remember if we spoke of this in the last community call, but we decided to use WAS0, the Tetra Labs implementation of WASM, because it's basically zero dependency, and it especially doesn't use SIGO, which is, of course, helps with all kinds of things, including cross-compilation and other things. And yeah, so we have a prototype that sort of works, but it's not very refined, and it's not very user-friendly. And by doing this prototype, we kind of opened the Pandora's box towards the general question of having function prototypes in Q, which we have to have a better answer before we can present WebAssembly. But we are also working on that proposal. But the biggest question, and I think this is a place where we would really welcome community input, is around question on ergonomics and how people wish to use this. For example, including even questions like what languages they want to use this with, because, for example, Go and other languages that can be compiled to WebAssembly use very different APIs, and it's right now we don't really support Go at all. We only support other languages that support the WASI standard, for example, like Rust and other languages. So we're really interested in how people want to use this and how do they expect, sort of like from the user's perspective, this to work. So we really welcome input on that. And we have a WebAssembly channel on Slack, and of course we can discuss this on GitHub, whatever you want. So we really welcome community input on this.
It might be worth Aram actually doing something similar to what Roger's done. Roger, did you just create a GitHub discussion?
Yes, I did. I just created discussion 2044 for talking about modules.
Yeah, so for soliciting that feedback, Aram, it might be worth sort of creating one of those and linking to that from the tracking issue. Cool. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I saw a comment come up. It flashed up on screen, a message from somebody. Oh, Sam, just noting, I've got a solid WASM case. Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay, so then that sounds like it'll be the first reply to the discussion you create then, Aram. Thanks, Sam.
Yep.
Yep. Where are we? Oh, goodness. Sorry, Carmen, I went one slide too far. Over to you for an update on docs and content.
Sure. Some of you did come to the docs and content call that we had 2 weeks ago, but I'm going to just do a brief recap. A slide deck and recording is made available Where to discover that, and this slide deck, in order to click on those links, will be available on the next slide. But the discussion centered around how we were going to look at documentation for qlang.org, and the four set themes that we broke down systematically were structure, substance, workflow, and governance. And so please watch the slide deck and the recording to see how we have listened to your feedback and how we're thinking about it and how we're going to think, essentially work and partner with the ecosystem to put a lot of learning content for qlang.org out there. Next slide. We've also had some new feedback channels, and I wanted to put those here. For those of you who have, and we were intentionally making these various feedback channels to just provide options. We have a person in this call that specifically asked for a docs and content Slack channel for certain reasons. Just maybe they didn't want to log into GitHub at that moment, or they recognized they needed something more ephemeral. So that's being added. We have an email address, documentation@q.works. We have discussions for you to add to in terms of your wish list of what you think qlang.org should look like, or what kind of content you want to live there, what sort of use cases you need to have in 1964 and 1995. And then the umbrella issue for updates to be shared is going to be 2008. For documentation at q.works email address, if you have an idea or a logo or a case study or a content need or documentation that you don't want maybe discussed in the wider project, but you have a use case you'd like to share, that is the feedback channel to do so. Next slide. Do you want me to go ahead and just talk about this as well?
Roll
Great. So QCon, and Paul and I were just in San Francisco yesterday to hear Marcel give a talk in the Languages of Infrastructure Beyond YAML track. So it was a great, great track, and Marcel's keynote will be made available probably at the end of November for the wider public consumption. But we've met lots of people in an unconference because it was about sort of talking about the shortcomings of YAML and how Q could meet that. So there's lots of good things to talk about there in terms of a report perhaps in the future, and to share the slides and the recording. And then Paul and I caught the red eye last night, and we are broadcasting live from Detroit at KubeCon. I am in a very different room from Sam and Paul, but we're all here. If you are at KubeCon and I don't know it, please let us know. Would love to meet with you. Next slide. So for today in particular, there's all these day or -1 events, and that have a real relevance to Q in general. And two of those are going to be GitOpsCon and Cloud Native Policy Day. Paul and I divided and conquered. Paul is currently at GitOpsCon and will return after this call. I'm at Cloud Native Policy Day. We have two people from VMware that will be giving a talk on Q at GitOpsCon. There's a lot of really interesting things happening out in the ecosystem where people are talking about how Q can really be a game changer. For GitOps, for those of you who don't know, is simply an extension of infrastructure as code, where version control Git is used as a source of truth for configuration. So a natural extension for Q. For Cloud Native Policy Day, if anybody is learning about this idea of policy as code, it's yet another type or abstraction to be able to codify things that should be lifted out of code, maybe processes, maybe governance, maybe compliance, and into a different language. And so the Open Policy Agent is one such. They use a different language called Rego. If you have heard, we are looking for future integrations for Q to work with Open Policy Agents. So I am on the ground listening to some really interesting talks on how people are handling their configuration pipelines in organizations large and small for things like, say, observability and logging. And I mean, just up and down the gamut. There's just configuration is everywhere, which I think I'll kind of end this on. That was the key takeaway for Marcel's talk in QCon, is you can't imagine how many places configuration is, and that configuration is the source of many, many outages. The stakes are very high to get configuration right in modern day and age. Next slide.
Cool. We're
All right.
into the community update time. So we want to spend a bit more time compared to the last community call, actually talking about what's going on in the Q community. So thanks to those folks who have either tweeted us or got in touch directly. So now we're going to have a sort of a bit of a run through those. Firstly, Dominic, yeah, Dominic's on the call. Dominic, do you actually want to take this in terms of an update about what's actually happened in the Encore world since we last spoke?
Cool, yeah. Yeah, so for those who don't know, Encore is a Go backend development engine for building cloud-native microservices without really worrying about the cloud you're deploying into. And we've been working with the wonderful folks at Q for 2 or 3 months now, just sort of designing how we want to support config in Encore. And Q was a natural fit for us. We focus on developer productivity and experience, and the type safety of Q gives us like all of that, and it just is an amazing language, as I think we all know from being here. So as of about 2 weeks ago, we shipped config. You can use Q directly within Encore apps. We auto-generate a bunch of Q for you based on what your application needs, and then you can write more Q to provide configuration for different environments. We also have isolated test support, so your Q can be overwritten for particular unit tests, and those unit tests and those Go routines will see the override values compared to other parallel tests, which is quite a nice feature we have. In the future, we're planning on adding real-time support to configurations, and what I mean by that is, in case of an incident, you can forcibly change a value on your running applications without having to recompile and redeploy the whole application. And we're also looking at integrating our secrets management so that you can reference secrets from directly inside your Q configuration without having to expose them to the configuration either. So lots of exciting things coming for Q and Encore in the future.
Very nice.
That's my update.
And thank you. I've linked to the release notes there. Is there any sort of other blogs or similar that you're going to be writing about this?
I have just finished drafting a blog on our decision to use Q and like what path we took in both designing or choosing Q over other languages and designing the API we ultimately came up with.
Wonderful. Okay, so we can share that. We'll share that via the QLang Twitter account as and when you have published that. Super. Thank you.
No.
Next one. Yes, Qvela. Actually, since the last call, we've managed to finally unblock Qvela in their upgrade from version 0.2.2. For a number of reasons, they were stuck on that version of Q. And so we're delighted that actually they've been able to upgrade to what might be 0.4.x, but will almost certainly be 0.5.0, as we've already tagged 0.5.0 alpha 1. Qvela are actually going to feature on a subsequent community call, so I won't try and paraphrase all the wonderful stuff they're doing. They will come on and talk about it themselves, but great to have them unblocked and able to upgrade. Yes, Carmen, do you want to take this one? Stefan from LeafWorks.
Yeah, so Stefan is really doing some great work trying to figure out the sort of this golden path for GitOps and Weaveworks. Weaveworks is the leading startup or company now that tries to lead in that paradigm, and they're increasingly seeing that Q seems to be a key part of that GitOps stack. And so you're seeing more and more of these integrations. I say watch this space. Weaveworks will be at KubeCon, very many of them. We look forward to speaking to them. But if you're interested in that space at all, take a look at Stefan's work and how he's integrating Q into Argo CD and Flux and Weaveworks.
Cool. Jonathan, are you still on the call? You are, because you were talking about wanting to share a bit more about how folks are actually using Q with Terraform. Do you want to chime in on this one?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I kicked off Qniform, spelt the way that you'd expect it to be spelt for this project, because it looks like a really good match between Terraform and Q, but obviously Q doesn't talk HCL, the HashiCorp configuration language. So there's obviously loads of different ways that we can integrate those things, and all the way from, do we just talk the same? Do we talk the JSON that HCL can be transcribed into? All the way up to, do we provide abstractions that then allow you to only be writing Q, not to be bothered with the underlying form of it? There's and lots of space in the middle. Quniform at the moment, it's a single repo with a discussion in it for people to, hopefully, folks to come and say, what is it you're actually doing in that space? What is folks' experience with using Q and Terraform in any way, shape, or form? So if you've got experience with it, if you've got things that you go, I tried this and it didn't work, anything like that, please just come and chuck something into the discussion there. It'd be lovely to hear. I haven't been tweeting and chatting about it a lot because I wanted to figure out a couple of things that I could do to sort of provide concrete things that you could do in some experiments. But for this sort of set of folks in this call now, if you've got any experiences with using Q and Terraform in the same combined in any way, come and chuck in a, I tried this, it worked, it didn't work thing. That would be lovely to hear from. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks, Jonathan. We've got a prime use case from the Q project in terms of wanting to manage many GitHub organizations and repositories, and someone has suggested Terraform might well be a good way of doing that. So rather than me go mad trying to maintain these things by hand, it feels like we actually need to make that project come to life at some point. So maybe that might actually be a practical, what's this Paul loves having? No, I really don't enjoy that at all. Having 50 GitHub repositories to manage, I'm frightened that I'm going to do something horrendous with one of these in terms of visibility settings. And obviously, if I can imagine a world of Q, Jonathan, where actually we declaratively specify what we want our configuration to be for all these different organizations and repositories, I'll feel more comfortable with that because I'll be able to see precisely what it is we're trying to achieve. But then how do we actually make that happen? So I'd be delighted if we wanted to use that as an example with Terraform to hack on that with you or indeed others. That would be a lot of fun, hopefully.
Fantastic, thank you.
Great. Next slide, where are we? Yes, this is, oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong slide here. There've been a number of interesting blog posts, and Richard gave a talk on behalf of his company, where he's talking about Q and this idea of model as code. And it's sort of kind of related to the next slide as well that I was going to bring up here. And this is an absolutely brilliant blog post that doesn't actually mention Q at all. But for those folks who are in the data space, who are talking about contracts that exist between different parts of data pipelines, or not even necessarily data pipelines, just contracts that one can sort of expect from data, it sort of feels like there's a really nice use case of a Q here. Maybe, as we've sort of briefly seen, those folks who are already using JSON schema or languages like that. I shared that schema's blog post widely internally at GL to much applause. Oh, which one was that, Sam? This one?
The one you're talking about right now.
Yeah, it was. So what was very interesting, I followed up with Jake afterwards and said, oh, hey, have you heard about Q? And it's almost as if the blog post was written with Q in mind, but quite fantastically, he hadn't actually heard about Q until 2 days after, when someone said, oh, have you heard about Q? And so it's sort of an incredible meeting of this sort of blog post in Q here. So maybe there's some sort of future call that we have with folks in, and I don't want to sort of pigeonhole people by saying in the data space here. I don't even really know what that means. But so when people talk about data and contracts, contract just seems like a really good word, and it feels like it has a lot of utility beyond just data. And indeed, Marcel's talk at QCon was very much about, well, you've got configuration in different parts of the system, and what that ultimately represents is contracts between these different parts of the system. So yeah, looking forward to chatting to Jake, and indeed, I think we possibly look to follow that up with some sort of a community call where we just have like an open mic session, for want of a better phrase, of people talking about their experience in this space and sharing ideas. That feels like it might be a really nice idea.
Could I add something there real quick?
Oh,
Just,
please do.
I mean,
Let me go back.
basically a yes and, but I mean, Grafana being in a data-centric space, this is something we think about and talk about all the time. I mean, our schematization work, well, first of all the Q-centric work is focused on schematization first, which to us is prerequisite to like the as code stories, the GitHub stories, all of that. But one of the other branching stories that happens after we have our nice rigorous schema basis is how we actually move into, schema for config is how we move into schema for data, because it has emerged very much in the data world. Data catalogs are a thing now, and they are essentially the result of years of discovery by people trying to run data organizations, figuring out that one of the most important things to do to actually run a high-performing data organization is to have a user updatable catalog of schemas that people who are not necessarily programmers can maintain, because they're the ones who actually know what the data is, and it is all tied back to schema. And there's so many interesting, I think, possibilities here that I am looking forward to getting into just at Grafana once we have a more general schema system of which data schemas can be one branch. There's a lot of potential here.
Fantastic. So it sounds like we have a sort of a call ready to go there, really.
So,
let me see if I can sort of coordinate folks around a time that works then, and we'll do like an ad hoc community call. Super, thanks, Sam. Sort of related to that really is just a call for what are you working on? If you have something interesting that you're doing with Q and would like to share that, please tweet. That's generally the easiest way, and include @Q_Lang. We will retweet with community, but as you've seen, what we're going to try and do as well is keep this as a standing thing for our community calls, where we share briefly what it is folks are working on, but using that as an opportunity to sort of suggest, as we've just done there, like ad hoc calls afterwards, where we might do deep dives on things like data or whatever it might be, or integration with JSON schema or something like that. We've had with our friends over in the JSON schema world, there's been some wonderful exchanges where because Q is not there to replace JSON schema, it's there to work with JSON schema or indeed other formats there. And so these things will often coexist. And so having those good relationships with folks in JSON schema world, protocol buffers world, all of this it's all about gluing it together. And so, yeah, where it makes sense to do deep dives and talk about what sort of experiences are folks coming from those different areas to Q, we'd love to do that. Slack, there's been a really nice uptick in activity in Slack actually since the last community call. A number of folks busily asking questions and answering them as well. Scott Lewis Kelly and August Feng, two names that we've seen a lot of, so thank you for helping out on answering questions. Just a link there to join the Q Slack if you're not already a member. It's sort of a bit more of an ephemeral chat space. We will be, as part of the qlang.org rework, taking all those great questions that are asked and putting those into more persistent sort of documentation formats on qlang.org. A number of folks since the last call have pinged us to say, yes, we're using Q. Please add your logo. Please add our logo. Encore, we see there. Benthos have got a really nice adapter that's using Q as well. Carvel, we heard about earlier on. VoxGig is the company that Richards was referring to in his the meetup talk he gave at Waterford Tech. And I forget the duck.
Fresca.
Fresca. Okay, great.
Yeah. The Factory for Secure Software Artifacts. They're here at QCon for Cloud Native Security Con, but it's all about how Q is being integrated into the software supply chain.
Okay, so that's I don't know about that one, but my guess would be it's from a policy perspective, and again, that's similar to what the folks at ChainGuard are doing. Grey Matter, they pinged us to say they're using a lot of Q, and I think they might be interested in actually chatting about that at some point, but I hope I'm not overcommitting on that by saying that. So now the new section in these new community calls are Spotlight On. And today's spotlight is on Dr. Tony Worm, and Tony joins us today Tony has been a long time member of the Q community. He will provide a bit of background on that. Almost everybody will have interacted with Tony at some point because he's easily one of the most active people in Slack, GitHub, discussions, issues, whatever it might be. Tony, before I sort of ramble on too much and cover your all the great stuff that you've done for the Q community, do you want to talk a bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. You can hear me and all that?
Yeah, really well.
All right, yeah. Hi, I'm Tony Worm. I guess my background, it's been, maybe I'll just keep it short and keep it closer to Q. I start before I got there with Hofstadter. I was trying to build like a full stack app in GraphQL, and I was like, iterating on that like API and what do these data models look like? And every time I changed something, I had to touch dozens of files to make that same change through the different parts of the stack. And I said, well, this is a pain. Why can't I write it down once, like as a source of truth? And so I did that, and then I've now been building Hofstadter and the Hof tool as like the thing that implements that. And there's a lot of interesting complexities. In general, it's about, we humans write code. How can we get machines to write code or help us write code? Like that kind of 80% rule, the Pareto kind of idea. And then sort of connected to that, what was I going to say? I just lost that thought. Damn, lost that thought.
Well, we can come back to that if you like. But
sure, yeah.
How did you find out about Q in the first place?
So the way I came to Q was I had hacked. We were using YAML as the source of truth for our code generation system, and I'd hacked imports into Q, and I was like, I looked at it afterwards. I was like, this is a terrible, terrible idea. And so kind of went on a search for like, well, what are we going to do? And we considered writing our own like DSL, or we looked at DAL, and then we found Q, and we tried it out for like 2 days, and we're just like, this is amazing. Like, this is exactly the kind of language you need for configuration. And my first experience with Q was similar to my first experience with Go. I ended up rewriting a project and removing more than half the code I had and gaining more features and like safety and all the things you want in good programs.
That's and so that was when, sort of like 2019-ish?
Yeah, it was around Q 0.2.1 maybe.
Okay, well, you're testing
I remember
me
the
there.
2 series. I don't remember the 1 series. It was a while ago.
And off the back of that, though, you've not only been working on Hofstadter and Hof, tutorials also came about during this time as well. To talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, tutorials kind of came out of this. I was learning Q, and one thing I understood from my graduate work is that teaching helps you learn something even better than you thought you knew it. And so tutorials was kind of born out of that. I wanted to just write about something, write about Q so I could learn it better, because when you have to explain it, you have to like think through it more. And then also, losing my thoughts. Sorry, I'm like on a different sleep schedule right now, so.
No worries. With what I guess tutorials has been invaluable for those folks who, whilst qlang.org has been lacking in terms of its documentation, tutorials has been a fantastic resource for folks. But I guess that's been only sort of part of the story of how you've been helping the Q community, is that you've been almost certainly the most active, maybe with the exception of Marcel, in terms of answering people's questions and the GitHub issue tracker or in Slack itself. Maybe just, well, obviously, firstly, thank you for all of that help that you've been providing folks. But what advice would you give someone who's looking to get involved in the Q project, potentially in that way? We talk of the different ways in which folks can contribute to Q. One of the obvious ways is by using Q, to my mind, but for those folks who perhaps want to learn by getting involved in a similar kind of way to which you have, what would your advice be for folks who are interested in responding to discussions or Slack questions? How would you go about suggesting they get involved?
That's interesting. I kind of think it's like there's probably just good generic advice to just like not be afraid to do it. I think a lot of people get hold up. Do I know like is my answer going to be good or not? And like, I don't worry about necessarily being right or wrong because it's kind of more of like a community effort. And if you're not spot on, somebody else will come along and correct you or enrich your understanding. And so instead of thinking about it as like more as like an individual, think about it as like a group effort, perhaps. I guess just I kind of have like the Q Slack open all the time, and I guess I get notifications from every like issue. Just like fully subscribe to the Q GitHub, and so I see kind of like everything. Although it's gotten quite busy, I must say, lately. And starting out tutorials was easy at first, and now like Q is growing so much, and there's it's hard for one person to be like an expert enough to write everything about Q. So it's good to see that the Q itself is like bringing in more people to like focus on different areas where Q is going to be useful.
Yeah, and I think kind of related to that point as well, it's as Q is very broadly applicable, as was obvious to me from the start, but sort of increasingly obvious with every person I speak to. It's like, oh my goodness, the use case you're talking to me about, I have got zero experience of. And so I think what we're going to need to do as the project is also work out how we create a rich community of folks who are able to help contribute to these issues where perhaps we need specific expertise in areas. And so having an active community and a community course like this is a really good starting point for that. So perhaps building on the point there that you made of the point you made where you said, well, it's difficult for one person to keep on top of all of these things here. But what do you see as being the biggest challenges facing that Q faces essentially now? Maybe there are implementation challenges, or maybe they're challenges from the perspective of like documentation, whatever it might be.
I don't see those as like big challenges in themselves. I think it's kind of just like an effort thing. One thing I've learned from writing documentation is that it takes surprisingly much longer than you expect it to take. It's a monumental effort. I do tutorials. I also do HOF. And one of the reasons I did tutorials was because it's far easier to write about something you aren't building yourself, so which probably isn't that surprising. I think maybe the biggest challenge is that Q is like applicable to every language and every piece of software out there, because everything deals with configuration, and like that's a crazy amount of complexity that's like you're trying to like unify it, not to like do a pun as well, but this is like getting back to like the code generation. When you think about like, can I just generate types from a Q definition? Well, there are different types of languages, right? There's like Go style structural typing, but then there's object-oriented programming. And how do you express class hierarchies, or how do you express different, public, private, protected kind of visibility? And these are, there's such spectrum of programming languages, and yet Q seems to like want to pair itself with every Git repository because everything has configuration. And so I think, managing that complexity is going to be the real challenge, because you're going to have some people coming from so many directions with so many different use cases. It's probably going to feel like overload.
I think we're definitely going to need to lean on expertise from folks in those fields, right? In terms of work out how to create that, not necessarily the perfect interface, but the best possible interface with when it comes to the adapters or whatever points of integration Q might have is either a language or from a tooling perspective as well. I sort of got a bit of a cliched question here, but if you had a magic wand that you could wave and implement any feature in Q overnight, what would it be?
Probably the module system.
Okay.
I think the dependencies will really unlock, being able to like have Q dependencies easily managed is going to really unlock it for a lot of people.
Okay.
Minus, I assume, the performance things will work themselves out, but I think that's really like the enabling side of the, like, I want to say the process of like, not necessarily process, but unblocks a lot of people from like sharing their stuff and making it consumable by everybody else. It'll like have a bend in the curve of the community adoption. I think it just ends, once Q is at that point, like it opens up a lot of interesting possibilities for reuse of code patterns across repositories. And I can't think of how many times I do a lot of DevOps, and how many times, like, in DevOps are people writing the exact same thing across organizations because there isn't a great way to share modules and packages in DevOps and configuration.
Yep.
It's going to be hugely impactful to like all of software.
Incidentally, if anybody else has a question they'd like to pose to Tony, please feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll just ask one last question. From a documentation perspective, is it, again, it sort of comes back to this question of giving people advice or ideas on how they can get involved. You've written a lot of documentation yourself. How would you, if somebody wants to write something as a way of sort of enforcing their learning, what would you suggest is a good way of getting started on that?
I would pair Q with something you already work on and do daily. You don't have to write something that's necessarily specific to Q, or like Q centric as much as like, I think, hey, I used Q in this interesting way. I think that's like, when like we look at Go or other languages, that's kind of the same pattern. There's like central documentation, but then the majority of like, when I go to learn something about Go, it's almost never at the Go official documentation. It's always like, I have this interesting problem, like, and then I come across somebody who's solved it in an interesting way with some tools I wasn't familiar with, and I get introduced to those things that way.
Yep. I'm seeing some chat messages.
You're welcome. Should probably get the chat open. Are there any questions?
Kevin Henderson, just want to say thank you, Tony. Q-Tutorials has been immensely helpful in learning and adopting Q. Well, Kevin, you won't be alone in that, so we'll reiterate that thanks on behalf of everybody else as well. Jonathan, 100% true, read DevOpsing. Okay, yep. And Sam, oh right, Sam empathizing on the documentation writing side of things. Okay, maybe we won't have a let's not have a sort of a breakout call on that, because maybe it'll just be people sharing their sob stories on that one, which won't be very energizing. But no, I think actually, joking aside, on the documentation side, that probably will be like sort of an ad hoc call we'd have for folks who are interested in creating documentation, kicking ideas around. Actually talking through those sometimes really helps to put shape to ideas on a an article or something that people might want to create. Have we got any other questions that folks want to answer? Ask Tony, excuse me. Did I see what Roger, Daniel, did either of you want to ask one about modules, or I'm getting lost here in all the messages? I'm not seeing any hands, so I will assume we're done on that. Tony, thank you very much for taking the time to join today.
You're welcome.
But
thanks for having me.
Reiterating, everybody, thanks for everything that you have done and continue to do for the Q community. And we look forward. I've linked from the slide here to Hoff, which is Tony's project, Tony's baby, and have a link. I guess, Tony, is there a place that people could perhaps ping you in the Q Slack if they had questions they wanted to follow up directly on afterwards on that?
Yeah, sure. You can ping me in Slack, Q Slack, of course. We also have our own Slack, and
okay, great.
I forgot to mention, we did cut a release this morning with some a new Hoff create, so you can, if you ever used React Create or Create React app from npm, it's kind of like that from any GitHub repository, but powered by Q.
Nice. And folks can find out about that by linking through to hofstadter.io or through to Hoff, I guess, and then take it from there.
Yep. All the information's on that website. I'll take you to the docs, and both have links. Great.
Tony, thank you very much. Let's move on to briefly talk then about future community calls we have. Tuesday the 29th of November will likely be the last call we have in 2022. We are outside of daylight saving, so that's 16:30 UTC. Spotlight on will be a surprise. We have 3 or 4 people who are vying to be the spotlight, so I'm just trying to work out whether we do 2 spotlights or just keep it at 1 for next month. Just a reminder that you can subscribe to the Q community shared calendar so you don't forget about these calls when they happen. The next slide is hopefully the next docs and content call. Carmen, do you want to briefly talk about that?
Sure. That will take place on 8 November. Again, it's an hour behind because we are returning, we're going outside of daylight savings. That also may very well be our last docs and content call. I think that we'll know closer to the day whether or not we'll have one last one in early December. So subscribe to the calendar.
Cool. And again, what we'll do is I talked about issue, and I've forgotten what issue number it is, whether it's 2000 or 2022 for the announce issue. I'm just going to quickly check. I think it was 2022. It was 2022. For all of these, we will be announcing and reconfirming effectively the times and linked discussions for each new meeting that we have via 2022, which is this new announced discussion. Finally, just a reminder of feedback. We're super open to hearing what folks would like to see more of, see less of, where they'd like more focus. Hopefully the community calls will sort of bed down into a more regular format. But again, we're super excited to be having these calls. And the docs and content call that we had earlier in October was fantastic. Just so many ideas coming from that. So please, if there are other calls that we want to have, that folks would like to have, we're happy to help coordinate and organize those. So Q&A is a bit of an odd title, but it's more sort of now open mic for anybody to bring up anything that they'd like to talk about, questions, or whatever else. Don't have any prompter questions or ideas for this month, so. We might even have covered it all, which I don't believe. Well, if there is anything that folks would like to bring up and sort of comes to mind after this call, please just feel free to ping us, and we can obviously bring it up on the next community call. Or, as I said, happy to set up ad hoc discussions between now and then. But otherwise, huge thanks to everybody for joining, and thanks again to Tony for being our spotlight for this week. And we look forward to seeing you either on the next docs and content call or on the final community call for 2022. Thanks, everybody. And for those who are at KubeCon, look forward to seeing you then. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.